I guess the basic question I've got is how does this let people get away with a crime? Are they not still able to be charged under this statute without stacking provisions?
Well, yeah, because all of
so they can be charged?
All of these other crimes would have a lesser of a sentence than smuggling would, and so therefore, if they're not stacked, then they don't get additional punishment for the additional crimes.
Do you understand the concept that when crimes are committed in the same criminal episode, that we have a punishment that we've assessed for those offenses, and then judges run those consecutively because they're part of the same criminal episode, and it has not been the practice of this legislature to divest ourselves of our legislative intent to set sentencing or set punishment guidelines for offenses in which what could be a two-year offense then becomes exacerbated to 20, 30, 40, 50 years?
I would argue that there are some areas where
very narrow exceptions. Sex crimes, you mentioned some of those. Multiple dead bodies in an intoxication manslaughter. What we're talking about here...
Human trafficking?
Human trafficking. What
which is very similar to smuggling?
What we're talking about here, though, in the underlying offense of smuggling, when you talked about it earlier about encouraging or those types of actions, that you're going to then take everything within that criminal episode, not only create a mandatory minimum for the other offenses, but then permit stacking on top of that. I know you're a rock rib Republican, and have been so for years, so I know that you're aware of the Trump administration backing off on these types of policies. Are you aware of that?
I'm sorry, say that again, I'm sorry.
Are you aware?
I was distracted.
I know. Are you aware that under the Trump administration, the concept was to move away from locking in sentences and creating disproportionate impacts on sentencing? That there was an expanded legislation under the Trump administration to start peeling some of that back because of judicial economy. It's an argument that's been held on both the left and the right side of the aisle. Are you aware of that conversation in criminal justice reform?
Yes, but I think that's the next amendment that you're going to propose.
We're going to talk about this for a while.
Okay.
I guess my question still is, because when you got up there and said this would allow people to get away with crimes, how does someone get away with a crime if they are convicted and sentenced to time in prison for an offense? Because that could still happen without stacking.
In the case that you're describing, they would commit the crime of smuggling, they would get punished for the crime of smuggling, they would commit other crimes, and then they would be served continuously or consecutively, and so therefore not get an additional penalty for those additional crimes. And that's what we're addressing in the bill.
Do you think being convicted of a crime is not a penalty?
Obviously, it's a penalty for the crime that you're being punished for. But if you don't have to serve any time for the additional crimes, then you're not paying for those additional crimes. You're only paying for one crime.
No, but when you're booked on offenses like this, you are serving all of that time. Time is time. And when you do the crime, you got to do the time. Absolutely. The point is, when we legislatively state that an offense should be subject to X penalty, and then we lob on top of it a stacking provision, like I said, which is outside the norm of what we do in criminal law when we're talking about the same criminal episode. When we're talking about the same criminal episode,
it's not outside of what we do entirely.
It is way outside the norm of what we do. There are very narrow exceptions in which we have changed that.
And we're already doing it for human smuggling, which is very similar to smuggling. I mean, for human trafficking, rather. I'm sorry, human trafficking.
Do you think it's fair for a 20-year-old kid that took $200 to drive someone from one end of town to the other to have offenses stacked on top of them?
If he doesn't know what he's being paid $200 for, if he thinks it's just being paid $200 to drive from point A to point B, and he doesn't know that he's trafficking someone because they're stuck somewhere in the truck or in the trunk, I don't think that he's going to be able to be prosecuted.
Well, there was a witness that came to testify when this bill was up in committee, and that witness said he was prosecuted for that. He was prosecuted for that. And by the work of his lawyer, he was able to get a different sentence. However, when you do these things and you create such a exposure for clients, and I know you don't practice in the legal world, but when we're advising clients, even if they have a decent case, the conversation is, we think you have a decent case, but the exposure has now been exacerbated to such an extent that the risk is way more than I can advise a client to take. So that young man in that situation, who had his lawyer be able to talk to someone and walk them back from that charge, is going to be in a completely different scenario now if this structure is in place, because the risk calculation is very different when you have stacking sitting in front of you. Do you think that is a fair system to put in place?
What we're trying to do with this bill is deter smuggling. We're upping the mandatory minimums. We're throwing the book at them. We're trying to deter smuggling. I understand your position, and I just have to agree to disagree.
Do you have some statistics on the deterrence effect of these laws?
There was a 2022 Federal Sentencing Commission study that found that for federal offenders that were released, the odds of recidivism were lower for federal offenders sentenced to more than 60 months rather than those that were sentenced to less.
Look, the studies that we've seen in this state on the deterrence effect of what we do, because there is no deterrence effect for these people like I just described, where they are in a pinch and are offered money to drive someone from one place to the next, and all of a sudden they are wrapped into a situation in which they are staring at 20, 30, 40, 50 years for something that this legislature, in some instances, has determined to be a misdemeanor, be that trespass or something else. Because it's not just the smuggling that you can stack on top of this. It's everything that is part of that criminal episode. So you're exacerbating all of that under that. Do you understand that's what this does?
The entire thrust of the bill is to elevate the mandatory minimums, to elevate the punishment, to deter this kind of criminal activity.
And my proposition to you is you can do all of that without creating a grave injustice and a bad situation for a lot of cases around the state where people are going to be wrapped up in a very high sentencing range, people that may actually be innocent of those crimes, but are going to end up pleading guilty because they know that the risk of going to trial is now sitting at 50 when that was nothing near what it would have been under the prior law. So when you say that someone is going to get away with the crime, I put it to you, someone is going to get convicted of a crime that they didn't commit. That's what happens when we do these one-size-fits-all, ill-advised policies. This is what happens. It's happening around our state right now under current laws and in the country. And there's been a retreat generally, even under Republican administrations, to get away from this type of practice.
If you're right, you should propose a bill to change the definition of smuggling.
I have been
That's how you would
fighting that
address
battle
that.
since 2013, Mr. Guillen. Thank you.